Welcome to this walk through Philippians 2 verses 17 and 18. Earlier in chapter 2, Paul presented in the Christ hymn a vision of the mind of Christ. In the verses that follow the hymn, he's been drawing out the implications of that vision. Beginning back in verse 12, he encouraged the Philippian Christians to exercise their salvation with awe and trembling, since God himself is at work within them to will and to act for his good pleasure. Paul wants them to do everything without grumbling and arguing, as faultless children of God, shining as lights in the midst of a bent and distorted world. One result of such obedience to God is that Paul will be able to boast at the end that he had not run or labored in vain. Now in the final sentence of this section, Paul adds further images of his work on their behalf. So here's our sentence. Let me read it through. Al e kai spendamai epi te thusia kai liturgia te spista os humon, Cairo kai sun Cairo passen humin, toda auto kai humes kairata kai sun kairatemoi. The first part of our sentence, verse 17, is a conditional. It's composed of the protasis with a and an indicative, spendamai, and then the apodosis is this finite verb, kairo, or actually both of them, kairo kai sun kairo. So these are the signs of a type 1 condition. Remember that type 1 conditions assume the condition to be true, at least for the sake of argument. And in this case, Paul really does think he's pouring out himself. So we begin with all, from Allah, and that often introduces a contrast, as you probably recall. And some people take it that way here. I think, however, that here we have an example of Allah used for an exclamation, something like, yes, indeed. That's the gloss that's suggested at the end of the article in Danker's Concise Lexicon on Allah for this exclamation. Now, among the translations I checked, this approach is adopted by the King James, by the English Revised Version from 1885, and then more recently by the New Jerusalem Bible. The kai here is probably a censive, so even. And putting these three words together, then we have something like, yes, indeed, even if. Then spendamai, in the passive. Spendo means to offer a libation, a drink offering. And so in the passive here, yes, indeed, even if I am being poured out as a drink offering. Now, a drink offering was usually wine or oil, and it was poured out in connection with other sacrifices. And that practice was common in Jewish and Gentile settings. For example, the list of daily offerings described in Numbers 28 includes the instruction, the drink offering is to be a quart with each lamb. Pour out the offering of fermented drink to the Lord in the sanctuary area. That's Numbers 28:7. And the word translated fermented drink there could refer to either wine or beer, but most often these libations would be wine, not beer, but this particular word is used in cognate languages for beer. So whatever the reference is, you can see the picture of pouring out a quart of liquid in connection with the sacrifice of the lamb in this case. Now, the present tense form of spendamai could indicate that Paul is referring to what he's currently experiencing as he suffers for the sake of the gospel and the spread of the faith, including his work on behalf of the Philippians. Some scholars, however, take this reference to potential martyrdom, even if I am to be poured out. Hellerman, in the EGGNT, lists some resources that take it that way. That's page 141. And we'll come back to that issue after seeing more of the sentence. But essentially we have a present tense here, either referring to what's actually happening to Paul now or with a future reference to his possible martyrdom or potential martyrdom. Going on, we have a prepositional phrase, epi, which is modifying the verb spendamai, and it's composed of a couple of different parts. This prepositional phrase is a good example of a section of Greek that's easy to translate but difficult to interpret, because we could render it simply upon the sacrifice and service of your faith. And that makes sense to us, but what does it actually mean And as we put it under the microscope, we discover that there's a number of issues involved here that can go in different ways for the interpretation. Many English translations translate both of these nouns along the lines of what I just gave, sacrifice and service. But since there's one article going with both of these nouns, this could be an example of hendiades. In other words, when two words are used to express a single concept. So usually one of these is functioning to modify the other, almost like an adjective. And so the question is then, which one is the basis and which one is the modifier? And so the English translations that go this route usually take thusia as modifying liturgia. In other words, you'd come up with something like sacrificial service or sacrificial offering, depending on how you interpret liturgia. And we'll come to that in a few minutes. So this could be the adjective modifying liturgia, a sacrificial service. But Speak, that's S-P-I-C-Q, but Speak in his Theological Lexicon of the New Testament, Volume 2, page 383, takes liturgia as describing the sacrifice. And he says it's, quote, emphasizing its public character and the ritual value of the offering. And that interpretation makes good sense, but it's hard to render in English since we don't have an adjective that works for liturgia. If you translated this upon the liturgical sacrifice, that would be a very misleading idea. So this could be a hendiades, but it seems better, I think, to take it as what Wallace would call a TSKS construction. In other words, an article with two substantives joined by chi, where both words are referring to the same thing and contributing their own imagery or content to a description of that one thing. And there's several different forms of relationship that this TSKS can indicate. And Wallace discusses all this on page 270 and following of his Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. Now, TSKS is related to what's known as the Granville-Sharp rule, which you may remember, but it's not an example of this would not be an example of the Granville-Sharp rule itself, because the Granville-Sharp rule applies only when neither of the nouns is impersonal. So for impersonal TSKS constructions, see Wallace page 286. So I'm going to take it that way, and so a simple translation works well here, the sacrifice and act of service. And the point of the construction is that by using one article for both nouns, Paul signals that this is a single act that he's referring to, not two different things, but by using these two different terms, he's bringing in two different aspects of this one thing that he's referring to. Now, what might that be? Well, first of all, let's look at the meaning of liturgia. In the Septuagint, this is usually used in reference to worship, but in the Greco-Roman context, it's often used to refer to public service. Here's part of Bedag's description of this word. Primarily public service, the usual designation for a service performed by an individual for the state or public cult, often free of charge. And see the literature under liturgeo, the verb form. In our literature, almost always used with some sort of religious connotation. As with the use of the verb liturgeo, New Testament writers suggest an aura of high status for those who render any type of service. So this is a very important word and a very important concept in the Greco-Roman world. Hellerman has a good description of this Greco-Roman background. He concludes, Paul thus frames the Philippians' priestly ministry in the service of the gospel as a counter-liturgia of sorts, one boasting of an aura of high status, and he's citing Bedag at that point, that ultimately exceeds anything associated with public services rendered by the elite luminaries of Philippi's local aristocracy. So Paul continues his countercultural expression of the gospel in this letter over against some of the values and worldview of the Greco-Roman world. Notice that Hellerman is taking this passage as referring to the Philippians' priestly ministry. And earlier I've been hinting at anyway, that it's Paul's priestly ministry. And we'll have to talk about that some more. But either way, this point still stands. It's a good point, whichever way the primary reference is to whose service we're talking about here. So Thusia, sacrifice, signals a clear reference to the context of worship, and now liturgia, this service, enhances that, and perhaps adds this further nuance from public life. Now, another question here in our prepositional phrase is the meaning of this preposition, epi. The dozen English translations I checked all take it as spatial. In other words, they translate it upon, or on, or over. But as far as I've been able to determine, libations were almost always poured out upon the ground, not upon a sacrifice. So it may be better to see epi here as a marker of object or purpose. That's the category from BDAG number 16 on page 366. So we could translate this something like, yes, indeed, even if I am being poured out as a libation for a sacrifice and act of service. So now the next part of our prepositional phrase is that final genitive, tes pisteos, humon. Some scholars, and again an example of this would be Hellerman on page 140, take this genitive as source or apposition. And since he takes the Thusia kai liturgia as Hindiades, he would translate that sacrificial service, so he would say something like, this sacrificial service refers to what the Philippians do, and it's sourced in their faith. On the other hand, this genitive could be objective and referring to Paul's sacrificial service or his sacrifice and active service on behalf of their faith. Since the previous sentence has referred to Paul's running and laboring on their behalf, I think this interpretation fits the context well. And recall also that a little earlier, back in chapter 1, Paul had said that his conviction that they need his help leads him to believe that he'll not be put to death during the present imprisonment. So then there are two main possibilities here for the main reference, and they're summarized nicely in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. This is a quote from the one-volume abridgment of the TDNT. As you see, it's from a longer article by Strathman in volume 4. There is a plain cultic nuance in Philippians 2:17 in view of the associated reference to libation. The point is either that the Philippians' faith is the offering, to which Paul will add the libation of his martyrdom, or that Paul's work in establishing their faith is the offering. Either way, the term liturgia has here the sense of a cultic or priestly ministry. So of these two views, my own view is that Paul is here referring to his own sacrificial service. And this is the approach taken by Fee and Ruman, among others. Here's Ruman's conclusion. He, in other words Paul, is already pouring himself out as libation in his missionary career and current situation. Therefore not of death, that refers to O'Brien's commentary, let alone martyrdom, another commentary, but apostolic labors and sufferings, including now prison. So taking the reference in this way, then, what we'd have is Paul adding to his athletic image of running and his work image of laboring, this image of sacrifice from worship, with the addition of a reference to acts of public service in the Greco-Roman context. So Paul is piling up imagery here regarding his own apostolic labors. And in this sacrificial imagery and act of public service, I think we can see a connection with the Christ hymn. In other words, this final sentence is pulling together what he's been saying in this paragraph in relation to the image in the Christ hymn. Paul became obedient even to the point of death, and his death was for the sake of others. So sacrifice and service are key aspects of the pattern we see in Christ, and Paul is modeling that same pattern of life, and thereby encouraging the Philippians to do so as well. So that's how I see the passage fitting together, and especially this paragraph after the hymn, being the implications from what we see in the hymn itself. So now we see the apodosis of this conditional. Even if I'm being poured out as a libation, I rejoice. And I rejoice together with all of you. Many English translations have something like, I am glad and I rejoice with all of you, just to not repeat the term rejoice twice. And then he goes on, ta auta, the same thing. In this case, it's an adverbial accusative or accusative of manner, in the same way. So, and in the same way, kai here being adjunctive, and humes, a little bit of emphasis, you also. And in the same way, you also rejoice, and rejoice together with me. These verbs could be indicatives or imperatives, and here the imperative makes more sense. Most English translations, or at least a number of them, have something like you should rejoice, and you should be glad, something like that. So the final part of our sentence then, and the end of this paragraph, returns to the theme Paul expressed back in chapter 1 of rejoicing in the face of persecution and suffering. The Philippians should not be discouraged or lose faith in the face of Paul's imprisonment, and neither should their own sufferings disturb them. In chapter 1, Paul noted that these seemingly disturbing events have actually turned out for the further spread of the gospel. And now in chapter 2, he gives an even deeper grounds for joy in such circumstances. It fits with what was seen in Christ's own life. It's an occasion for trust and obedience to the Father, sharing in the very life of the Son, and thus finishing our own course well, as the Son did his.